Complete composition. Painted in July 1890, Wheatfield with Crows is one of Vincent van Gogh's final works before his death. This iconic oil painting, 50.5 centimeters times 103 centimeters, exemplifies the artist's emotional state during his last days in Auvers-sur-Oise, France. The composition showcases a dramatically turbulent sky above a golden wheat field, with 3 diverging paths and numerous black crows in flight. Many art historians interpret this painting as Van Gogh's visual premonition of death, though this reading remains debated. The painting's intense colors, dynamic brushwork, and emotional power make it one of the most recognizable and discussed works in Van Gogh's oeuvre. Turbulent Sky. The dramatic cobalt blue sky dominates the upper portion of the canvas. Rendered with vigorous, swirling brushstrokes that create a sense of turbulence and emotional unrest. Van Gogh applied the paint thickly, with visible directional strokes that enhance the feeling of movement and agitation. The artist's distinctive impasto technique is clearly visible here. Where paint is layered so thickly, it rises from the canvas surface, creating both visual and physical texture. This threatening sky contrasts sharply with the golden wheat below, enhancing the painting's emotional tension. In his letters, Van Gogh often discussed how sky treatments could convey psychological states, and this tumultuous sky is often interpreted as reflecting his inner turmoil. Crows in flight, left. The black crows, rendered as simple V-shaped brushstrokes, create stark contrast against both the blue sky and golden wheat. These birds were common in the fields where Van Gogh painted and appear in several of his late works. Symbolically, crows have long been associated with death and ill omen in various cultures, which contributes to the painting's ominous interpretation. Van Gogh's technique for depicting the crows is notably economical. With just a few brushstrokes, he captures their essence in flight. This section shows how the crows appear to be taking flight from the left side of the canvas, creating visual movement that draws the viewer's eye across the painting. Crows in flight, right. The right portion of the sky contains another cluster of crows, creating visual balance with those on the left. The repetition of these dark figures against the vivid blue contributes to the painting's rhythmic quality and sense of movement. Van Gogh's placement of the crows throughout the upper canvas creates a dispersed pattern that suggests chaos rather than order. The birds appear to be flying in different directions, enhancing the feeling of disorientation. This compositional choice contributes to the emotionally charged atmosphere that permeates the work. The contrast between the dark birds and bright background exemplifies Van Gogh's mastery of using complementary elements to create visual tension. Golden Wheatfield. The brilliant yellow-gold wheat dominates the lower portion of the canvas, rendered with Van Gogh's characteristic undulating brushstrokes that suggest the movement of wheat in a breeze. This vibrant field represents one of Van Gogh's favorite subjects. He painted numerous wheat fields throughout his career, finding in them both practical subject matter and profound symbolic meaning. The wheat is depicted with varying shades of yellow, ochre, and golden browns, creating visual depth and texture. Van Gogh applied the paint with directional strokes that follow the contours of the land, enhancing the three-dimensional quality of the landscape. For the artist, wheat symbolized the cycles of nature and human life, growth, harvest, and rebirth, making this radiant field a potent symbol in his visual vocabulary. Left path through wheat. The leftmost path cuts through the wheat field in a curve, rendered in earthy reddish-brown tones that contrast with the surrounding golden wheat. Van Gogh's use of complementary colors, blue-orange, yellow-purple, throughout the composition creates vibrant visual tension. This winding path appears to lead nowhere definite, possibly reflecting the artist's sense of uncertainty about his own journey. The path's execution shows Van Gogh's technique of applying paint in thick, directional strokes that follow the path's trajectory, enhancing the sense of perspective and movement into the distance. Paths were recurring motifs in Van Gogh's work, often serving as metaphors for life's journey and choices. Central path. The central path cuts more directly through the wheatfield, rendered in a mix of greens and browns that create a distinct line through the golden expanse. This path's more direct trajectory contrasts with the winding nature of the side paths, creating visual variety in the composition. The central position of this path draws the viewer's eye into the painting and creates a strong sense of perspective. Van Gogh's brushwork follows the direction of the path, with strokes that lead toward the horizon, enhancing the feeling of depth. The three diverging paths have been interpreted as representing life choices or the confusion the artist felt about his future direction, adding psychological depth to what might otherwise be viewed as a straightforward landscape. Right path. The rightmost path veers off in yet another direction, completing the trio of diverging routes through the wheatfield. This path appears less defined than the others, with brushstrokes that blend more subtly into the surrounding wheat. The three paths together create a dramatic compositional element that suggests multiple possibilities or life choices, none of which appears to lead to a clear destination. Art historians have noted that this unusual composition, with paths leading nowhere definite and scattered crows above, contributes to the painting's disquieting emotional impact. The path's directionless quality has been linked to Van Gogh's increasing sense of disorientation and uncertainty in the final months of his life. Horizon line. The horizon line separating the wheatfield from the sky is not straight but undulates slightly, following the contours of the land. This subtle irregularity adds a sense of naturalism to the composition, while contributing to the overall feeling of movement and unease. Van Gogh's placement of the horizon line relatively high in the composition gives greater emphasis to the wheatfield below, allowing the viewer to feel immersed in the landscape. This compositional choice was common in many of Van Gogh's landscapes, reflecting his deep connection to the land and its emotional resonance for him. The lack of any buildings, trees, or human figures on the horizon enhances the feeling of isolation and emotional desolation that pervades the painting. Sky brushwork detail. A closer examination of the sky reveals Van Gogh's extraordinarily expressive brushwork. The blue contains subtle variations in tone and intensity, with darker blues intermingling with lighter areas. The artist applied the paint with vigorous, curved strokes that create swirling patterns suggestive of wind or emotional turbulence. This technique, developed fully in Van Gogh's mature style, evolved from his earlier encounters with Impressionism and his study of Japanese prints. The visible brushstrokes are a hallmark of Van Gogh's expressive technique, where the physical act of painting becomes part of the artwork's emotional content. The directional quality of these strokes guides the viewer's eye across the canvas and contributes to the painting's dynamic visual rhythm. Wheat texture detail. This close view reveals Van Gogh's technique for rendering wheat, with individual brushstrokes creating the impression of countless stalks and ears of grain. The artist used a variety of yellow and gold tones, applied with directional strokes that suggest the natural growth pattern of wheat. Van Gogh's fascination with wheat fields stemmed from his rural upbringing and his reverence for agricultural life, which he viewed as more authentic and meaningful than urban existence. The thick application of paint, impasto, creates actual texture on the canvas surface, allowing the painting to capture and reflect light in complex ways. This technique gives the wheat a vibrant, almost three-dimensional quality that photographs cannot fully capture, but is striking when viewed in person. Path brushwork detail. The brushwork creating the paths demonstrates Van Gogh's technique of using color and direction to suggest three-dimensional form. The artist applied paint in thicker strokes along the paths, using browns, greens, and reddish tones that contrast with the surrounding yellows. These paths are rendered with brushstrokes that follow their direction, enhancing the sense of perspective and movement into the distance. The visible texture of the paint creates small ridges and valleys that catch light differently, giving the paths a tactile quality. This attention to surface texture was characteristic of Van Gogh's mature style, where the physical qualities of paint became increasingly important to his expressive aims. Crow brushwork detail. This detailed view shows how Van Gogh depicted the crows with remarkable economy of means. Each bird is rendered with just a few quick, dark brushstrokes in the shape of a V or M. Despite this simplicity, the birds are immediately recognizable and full of life and movement. This approach reflects Van Gogh's evolving style, which increasingly favored expressive force over detailed naturalism. The stark black of the crows against the vivid blue sky creates maximum contrast, making the birds visually prominent despite their relatively small size. Art historians have noted that this technique of using simple, bold forms to create powerful visual effects shows the influence of Japanese woodblock prints on Van Gogh's aesthetic sensibility. Sky color variations. The blue sky, while dominant, contains subtle variations in tone and intensity. This area shows how Van Gogh incorporated lighter blue patches that suggest clouds or atmospheric effects. These variations add visual interest and depth to what might otherwise be a monotonous expanse. The artist's sophisticated understanding of color is evident in how he modulates the blue, creating a dynamic surface that suggests movement and changing atmospheric conditions. This approach reflects Van Gogh's synthesis of Impressionist techniques with his own more expressionistic style. The emotional quality of the sky is enhanced by these variations, with the lighter areas creating momentary relief from the intense, almost oppressive blue that dominates much of the upper canvas. Horizon transition. The transition between sky and wheat at the horizon shows Van Gogh's technique for creating depth and atmospheric perspective. Rather than a sharp line, the artist used gradations of color and brushwork to suggest the natural blending that occurs at the horizon. This area demonstrates the artist's careful observation of natural phenomena, despite his highly expressive style. The horizon line is painted with shorter, more horizontal strokes that differ from both the swirling sky above and the undulating wheat below, creating a subtle boundary between these two dominant elements. This transitional zone helps integrate the composition while maintaining the distinct character of each major area. Left foreground detail. The lower left corner of the painting shows how Van Gogh handled the foreground of the wheat field. The brushstrokes here are particularly thick and varied in direction, suggesting the complexity of vegetation closest to the viewer. This area contains more variation in color, with greens and browns mixed into the predominant yellows, creating a sense of lush abundance. Van Gogh's technique of painting wet on wet is evident here, where colors blend slightly at their edges while maintaining their distinct character. The foreground's detailed treatment helps establish depth in the composition, drawing the viewer into the scene before the eye moves toward the paths and horizon beyond. Right foreground detail. The lower right section of the painting demonstrates Van Gogh's technique for creating visual interest through variations in color and brushwork. Here, reddish-brown tones intermingle with the golden wheat, possibly suggesting soil or different types of vegetation. The directional quality of the brushstrokes in this area helps lead the viewer's eye toward the right path and into the composition. Van Gogh's careful attention to these details reflects his deep engagement with the landscape and his desire to capture not just its appearance, but its emotional resonance. The rich variety of colors in what might initially appear to be a simple yellow field reveals the artist's sophisticated understanding of how natural light affects color perception. Compositional balance. This view demonstrates how Van Gogh achieved compositional balance despite the painting's intense emotional content. The horizontal bands of sky and wheat are roughly equal in size, creating a stable foundation. This is dynamized by the diagonal paths and scattered crows, which introduce movement and tension. The result is a composition that feels simultaneously balanced and unstable, a visual parallel to the artist's psychological state. Van Gogh was highly conscious of compositional principles, having studied art books and older masters extensively. This painting shows his mature ability to create a composition that serves expressive ends while maintaining formal coherence. The balanced yet disturbed quality contributes significantly to the work's emotional impact. Historical context. Created in July 1890 in Auvers-sur-Oise, Wheatfield with Crows is often considered one of Van Gogh's final paintings. Completed shortly before his death from a self-inflicted gunshot wound on July 29, 1890. During this period, Van Gogh was under the care of Dr. Paul Gachet and had been experiencing severe bouts of mental illness. Despite these challenges, his final months were extraordinarily productive, with the artist creating more than 70 paintings in 70 days. The Auvers countryside, with its wheat fields, inspired many of these late works. This painting's unusual double-square canvas format, approximately 50.5 centimeters times 103 centimeters, was one Van Gogh used for several panoramic landscapes in his final period, allowing him to capture the expansive feeling of the open countryside that so moved him emotionally. Legacy and interpretation. While often interpreted as Van Gogh's final statement or a premonition of suicide, art historians now question this reading, noting that several other works were likely completed after this painting. Regardless of its exact chronology, Wheatfield with Crows remains one of Van Gogh's most powerful and emotionally charged landscapes. The painting entered the collection of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam through the inheritance of the artist's brother Theo's family. Since its first public exhibitions, it has captivated viewers with its intensity and expressive force. Its influence on subsequent generations of artists, particularly expressionists, has been significant. The painting exemplifies how Van Gogh's unique vision transformed a simple rural scene into a profound statement about human emotion and the turbulent relationship between humanity and nature. Today, it stands as one of the most recognized and psychologically complex landscapes in Western art.